I survived domestic violence. I spoke up. I chose to live. It was not easy. I made it. After I finished college, I met my first husband at church. He did not smoke, swear, drink, or use drugs, and knew the Bible inside and out. Seemed as if he would be a godly mate, but he only had a form of godliness. 2 years after we married, my husband began to abuse me. Emotionally, mentally, verbally, physically, and through the intimate relationship in marriage. My husband told me that he hated me, that I was fat, that everyone hated me, that God hated me, that I was worthless, and that I should be dead. He controlled everything. I could not buy my own clothes, personal items, or the food for the home. I literally had to beg for money, even though we had the best of everything. I had a very good job in the medical field, but I had to hand over every penny to my husband. My husband was a deacon in the church for many years, and the leaders never believed me about the abuse. I pretended that everything was perfect, and I lived as a prisoner in my own home. He denied he ever did anything wrong. He lied and made excuses to make himself look good. He would use threats to scare me, and I lived in fear and with great anxiety every day. I had 2 miscarriages and a tubal pregnancy with no support from my husband. When I was 7 months pregnant with my son, my husband tried to push me down the stairs. Ended up punching his hand through the wall instead. After having my 3 children, I developed over 12 different mental illnesses from the abuse and was taking over 20 psychiatric pills a day. My husband abused me physically and sexually, and I never told a soul. After 23 years of praying and keeping silent and living in fear, even though we went to counseling, there was no more help for our marriage, and we divorced. I soon after met my second husband, and I had the privilege of leading him to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. He became a huge encourager in my life. He helped me with my mental illness. He encouraged me with my weight loss and even with my walk with God. I got pregnant just 4 months after we got married, but had another miscarriage, and he was very supportive. In the beginning, things were very good, but I soon found out things were always either very good or very bad. But soon after, in 2010, he assaulted me and threatened me. It was the worst day in my entire life. The severity of his actions were so bad that they sent 4 state troopers to make sure I was safe. My husband went to jail for 35 days. The state of Maine placed a protection order against him. He came up with this wild story about medication in his heart and got out of jail, and I let him back home. I did not believe in the abuse, but I did believe in the institution of marriage. Our marriage was not good. It was great for those 2 years. He slipped back into his old behaviors, and he committed adultery. In 2012, his youngest brother died in a snowmobile accident in Green, Maine. From then on, he never got his life back together. 4 months later, he began drinking, swearing, and using drugs. He told me he was sick and had many jobs. This is always a pattern of his bad behavior. July 4th weekend, he became very angry, and I tried to stay away, but eventually he came after me with a butcher knife. He screamed at me and started yelling and crying. Then he held the knife over my head. Then he walked away and put the knife down and threw a lamp across the room. Then he threw a wooden table at me, threw a hammer at my TV, and broke it. He was a big man, hands, height, everything. He then took the knife in his hand again and placed his other hand around my neck. He began to scream at me, and as his hand was on my throat, he raised the knife over my head. He told me he was going to stab me and cut me up into pieces and throw me in the river. I am not sure how, but I convinced him to put the knife down, and then he left and walked down the street. I called the police and they arrested him. Another protection order was placed. by the state of Maine against him. He went to jail for another 30 days. He told his lawyer he wanted to come home and drink. I told his lawyer he could rot in jail. But by the grace of God, before his lawyer spoke to him, he changed his mind. He received 1 year probation, a court-appointed alcohol and drug counseling. He also has a conviction of domestic violence and criminal threatening. I did let him home. I did not believe in the abuse, but I did believe in the institution of marriage. He was really good while on probation until Christmas holiday of 2013. He began acting like a crazy man. I cannot even describe it. Christmas Eve, he tells me that he was going to visit his brother for a few hours, does not come home for 10 days. He begins drinking and doing drugs again and comes home one day and tells me he committed adultery again. Then he becomes inappropriate towards everyone and starts selling the stuff in our house to support his drug habit. One night he comes home and tells me that he's been looking for a gun to kill me. After he leaves, I go down to the courthouse and place a protection order against him. But it means nothing. He violates it over and over. Then he calls telling me he has nowhere to go and the only people he can stay with are doing drugs. Against what I think is right, I let him home and drop the protection order. In October 2015, he becomes violent again. The Rumford police officers were called to my home 3 times in 4 days. During that time, my husband had shot me with a gun twice in the head. He told me if I went to the hospital or called the police, he would kill me. So out of fear, I did nothing. One day we were in the kitchen and he was standing in front of the back door. He was threatening to hit me. So I opened the door behind him and I pushed him out the door with my 2 hands and locked the door and called the police. It took some convincing, but an officer from the Rumford Police Department told me to file another protection order, and I did. Before the permanent order was granted, he violated the order and was arrested, but made bail and got out of jail. I had to face a judge and convince him of the abuse. Even though my husband denied it, the judge granted the protection order. The permanent order was placed on December 17, 2015. Since then, it has been violated at least 4 more times. He has violated the protection order, stalked me, and threatened me many times. 3 hours later, after he went to jail for 6 months, 3 hours later, he violates the protection order again. Released again on a technicality. Then he leaves town, has the hospital call me, has his brother call me. I begin getting strange phone calls. I begin getting hang-up calls, and then I get a text message threatening me. I have lived in fear for the last 7 years. It is only by the grace of God that I can tell my story. The protection order means nothing to the abuser. The law is not on the side of the victim, but I am a survivor. Now I am moving on with my life, and God is leading me and strengthening me to share my story. The domestic violence in our community, in our homes, in our churches, and in our country needs to stop. The laws need to be on the side of the victim. We need to fight for the victims of domestic violence. We need to support them and give them the resources to get out of their situation. Now is the time to take action to stop domestic violence. Then nobody else has to suffer the hurt and nobody else is murdered. It is time to stand up, speak out, and support the victims of domestic violence. Deuteronomy 30, verse 20 says, "Love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, that you may cling to him, for he is your life and the length of your days." I share my story, hoping and praying that it will show how serious domestic violence is. Deuteronomy 31, verse 6 says, "Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. There is no excuse for abuse. I've suffered over 30 years of abuse, and I am healing, and you can be healed too. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-SAFE. I survived domestic violence. I spoke up. I chose to live. It was not easy, but I made it. I am a survivor, and you can be too.